Cavafy was one of the most important poets of his era, but he never published a book of poems. How does that work? How can you be an important poet, but not ever publish a book of poetry? I think this conundrum brings up an important question in the history of poetry and in the enjoyment of poetry, namely, what is the best frame for a poem? What's the best medium for a poem? What's the best amount of poetry to publish a poem within? Cavafy published poetry in newspapers. One of his first poems was published in Constantinople newspaper in Alexandria. His poems appeared in newspapers not only in Alexandria, but on mainland Greece, in Istanbul, as far away as Vienna, even London. T.S. Eliot, in his periodical The Criterion, published some of the first English language translations of Cavafy's poetry. So if you wanted to read Cavafy's poetry, you needed to look in newspapers or magazines. Now, one thing that Cavafy did, which I think a lot of poets do, is he collected the newspapers and the issues of magazines that publish his poetry, and then he made copies of the pages that has poems on them, and he would, hand them out to friends. In fact, there's sort of this collector's market that started in the early 20th century of these printed pages, basically copies of the newspaper or the periodical page that Cavafy's poems are in. Cavafy sometimes would print out his poems really large in what's called broadsheets and kind of hand them out. Broadsheets are really simple, cheap ways to publish poems, and this actually goes back several hundreds of years, where you'd publish especially popular poetry, ballads, things like this, on big kind of newspaper-sized sheets of paper. So a poem can appear in a newspaper on a page, maybe on several pages if it's long. It could appear in a magazine. It could appear on a broadsheet. Sometimes Cavafy would put his poems together in little leaflets, maybe only of a couple pages, that he would hand out to people or, sign and, give away at a literary gathering. The most he did toward a book was just for his own private use. He would bind together, usually in what we would think of as a chapbook, published poems from major periods of his life, say the 1890s or the 19-teens. But he wouldn't send these out to publishers. And it's interesting to think that you can have a poetic career in the early 20th century without publishing a book of poetry. But it means that people are experiencing your poems in mediums, in frames, in ways that are different than the book of poetry. And it's got me thinking about this question of what's the best medium, what's the best frame, what's the best size of poetry, especially in its official publication. I have here a collection of little chapbooks, and I want to show them to you. The first one is the Riverside Literature Series. It was these softback, and you can see on the back that there's dozens of Riverside Literature Series chapbooks. This is Henry Longfellow's Evangeline, and it's lovely. It's actually pretty long. This is about 115, 120 pages long. This was published around the turn of the century by the Riverside Press. 1883 was the first printing. This is a 1916 edition. And it's cool to see that, this was a way people experience poetry in these little Riverside Literature Series. I think you could even subscribe to these, but you could probably buy them at a bookstore. This would probably end up, kind of in the periodicals section at Barnes & Noble or at Walmart or Target. I'm dating myself by focusing on Barnes & Noble. But, I suppose that, Amazon.com, if it existed in the 19-teens, would have been a place to get this. But I want to show you some other chapbooks I have. I love this one. This is one of my favorite chapbooks. This is Riot by Gwendolyn Brooks. Has this great picture of Brooks on the back. This is about 25 pages long, and it's just 3 poems. They're long poems: A Riot, The Third Sermon on the Warpland, and An Aspect of Love, Alive in the Ice and Fire. You gotta love those Gwendolyn Brooks titles. But there's not a lot of poetry in this, and yet these are poems all written together. Riot is a title that Brooks got from Martin Luther King Jr. The riot is the language of the oppressed, or something like that. A riot is the language of the unheard. I think that's the title. It's got this wonderful design. This is published by Third World Press, which is they hold the license to Gwendolyn Brooks's work, and it's just so cool. It's just a cool little book. This was first published in the 60s, in 1967. This is a more recent chapbook. This is a treatise of civil power by Geoffrey Hill, put out by the Klutog Press, and it's hard to tell, but there's a wonderful texture to this page. It's not glossy like Riot is. You can even see the little thread here that's holding together this book. This like Brooks is only a couple dozen pages long. You can see that it was printed in such a way that you can almost see the texture and the imprint of the ink upon the page. Why am I showing you these? Well, I think that something like this, or something like Riot, is a little bit more the size that Cavafy thought in, and he would bind his poems in. But he didn't send them out to the Third World presses, or the Klutog presses, or the Riverside presses of his day. These were just for him. The individual poems appearing either in the broadsheets or in the newspapers, they were enough for him. He saw them as the proper place for his art. And this brings me to a point that I don't know that I have big conclusions about this, but I think it's a point that is important to make. It's not entirely clear that the bound paperback, or hardback for that matter, is the best place or medium for poetry. When I lived in the UK, I spent some time in London. And for many years now, there's been an initiative called Poems on the Underground. And you'll see basically where the advertisements are on the London tube. There'll be, advertisements for, Harrods, or advertisements for Guinness, or advertisements for, women's razors. But in among those advertisements, they're about a foot tall and a couple feet wide. In among those, there's these panels called Poems on the Underground, and there will be poems. I'm going to show a couple here so you can get a sense for them. You can see that these poems, some are old, by people like George Herbert. Some are more recent. Some are translations from other languages that have both the poem in the original language and translated into English. These are whole poems. It's a whole piece of art up there on the London Underground for you to read while you sit and wait. If you're going, Euston via Bank, you can read a George Herbert sonnet, or a tanka, or a couple haiku while you travel. It would be weird to say, well, it's not really a poem because it's not in a book. And yet I think we're very Librocentric in our view of poetry. Take, for instance, the kind of career trajectory of the contemporary poet. There are expectations of the professional poet. Now, professional doesn't mean you make your living from poetry, but you've gone through the proper channels. You publish in edited magazines, newspapers, collections. Maybe you have an MFA in poetry, or at least studied creative writing at the undergraduate and hopefully graduate level. There's this kind of progression of, well, you publish in magazines and newspapers until you have enough poems that you might publish a chapbook. Now, the chapbook no one's going to read, and no one's even heard of the press, but you publish a chapbook or two, and then you're ready for the real time, the whole poetry collection. And I think I've talked in this channel before before about how, the chapbook can be, between a dozen pages and about, 30 or 40 pages. And the full length collection is kind of the 50 plus page collection. Often, poetry collections of major poets these days run to over 100 pages, which I often think are crazy bloated. If Gwendolyn Brooks can drop Riot in 1967 and kind of give the definitive account of civil rights era, Chicago black poetry in 22 pages, I don't think you need 150 pages. Publishers, I think, want big, thick collections of poetry because they feel like it's worth it to publish it, especially bigger publishers. If you're Penguin, if you're Houghton Mifflin, if you're Faber and Faber. Now, I should pause on the Faber thing. Faber in America is, I think, reticent to publish the smaller collections. Faber, especially the Faber Poetry Division in the UK, routinely publishes, 30 to 50 page poetry collections. And I'll put a picture up here of a couple of Faber publications of the last few years. Faber has this kind of wonderfully spare design where it'll be a single block color and then the name of the poet in a sans serif font, and then the name of the collection. And usually it's 3 tones. So you have the background tone, and then the name of the poet is in one color, and the name of the collection is another color. And it's a pretty, I really like the design. Faber designs are famous, just like Penguin designs are famous. But I think in the UK, there's more of a risk that publishers take, and they're willing to take that risk for shorter collections, whether they be chapbooks or paperbacks or even hardbacks that, I don't know, maybe it's a 40-page hardback, of Wendy Cope poems or, of Don Patterson poems, but they're willing to publish that shorter form poetry. But I'm even saying that I think, thinking about Cavafy and his life, I'm not willing to say that, to be really legitimate or to be taken seriously, a poet has to even collect more than one poem together to have done something of significance. Whether it's a poem on the underground, whether it's a poem in a newspaper, whether it's a broadsheet that, gets published. The Scottish Poetry Library, where I used to hang out when I lived in the UK, they would publish each spring these broadsheets. They would, take usually a poem that had been published in a newspaper or a collection, and they would do a really lovely big poster of it, sometimes accompanied by art. And it was a whole poem, it was a whole piece of art. So I think there's a couple principles to draw from this. Poetry is an art form where you can have a whole instance, a whole art object in one small poem. You don't need a collection of poems to have a complete poetic unit or a complete poetic experience, a complete experience of poetry. All you need is an individual poem. And that poem could be on a website. That poem could be in a newspaper. That poem could be on a broadsheet. Heck, that poem could be scrawled in chalk on the sidewalk. And as long as you can read it and you have the time to read it and experience it, you've experienced a whole poem. Now, newspapers, magazines, publishers of chapbooks, publishers of full-length collections, they are important. They are ways of putting poetry before us in a way that we can understand it, in a medium we can understand it, as a this is worthwhile to read. It's sitting here, well designed, well edited, at the bookstore or on Amazon. This is a way of marketing good poetry to me and signaling this is legit poetry by a legit poet. You should pay attention to it. And yet, that's not the only marker. You could see it on the tube. You could see it at a bus stop. You could see it scrawled, I guess, in skywriting if it needs to be. You can have a whole poem that's on its own. And, I've run into some contemporary poets who have said, they don't like poetry collections. They feel off-put by them. So many poems in a row. If I read it like I read a novel, I would read it way too fast. I only want my poem, individual. in a newspaper, in a broadsheet, something like that. So I hope I've made an argument that we could expand our understanding of and our expectations for poetry, and not demand, like, my poetry has to be in a big, thick book where it's not really poetry. It's not true. And I think, searching for, these wonderful gems of short chat books that just have a couple poems, but, really are instances of great poetry is important. Also, I think as a writer, speaking to other writers, I often want to encourage a writer, like, if you work really hard and get one good tanka or one good sonnet, like, good job. Like, be proud of that. Don't feel like, well, I haven't written a full poetry collection's worth of sonnets, or, I haven't written 100 tanka like the great masters before me. So, my worth isn't really valuable, or I was kind of wasting my time. No, that's not the right viewpoint. The novelists have set this sort of standard of, it has to be, 80 to 100,000 words to be a complete literary work. Yeah, that's true for a novel. That's not true for a short story. That's not true for a novella. But the novel kind of set our standard of how thick a book should be, the size of a book, even how the pages should be laid out. But poetry is pushing against those expectations, subverts those expectations in a really good way, I think. So let poetry be poetry. Let a poem be a poem. Let a novel be a novel. And enjoy both for what they are. And don't ask them to be each other. I love talking about poetry. I love being on YouTube. And I thank you so much for watching. And those of you who already support me on Patreon, thank you so much. For those of you who want to support, if you subscribe and if you support and become a paying member, you get behind the scenes videos. You get longer unedited book reviews, rants on the state of publishing and poetry, things like that give you a little bit more behind the scenes of both this channel and the things that I care about and want to bring to you on a weekly basis on the YouTube channel. So once again, thank you so much for watching this channel. Head over to Patreon if you're interested, and thanks again for watching.